Hi everyone, I think the live video is starting, but I'm just going to give it a moment. As I just put in the chat, please feel free to comment any questions that you have if you are watching live, but I also have a series of questions that I'll be going through that we had people submit ahead of time having read the report. So just to do a really quick recap first of what I'm talking about, this Q&A is about a study that Faunalytics recently put out about advocate retention. So specifically, we surveyed current and former animal advocates in the US and Canada and asked them about their reasons for leaving previous organizations, their experiences as animal advocates, and how those experiences were related to their current intentions around staying in the movement versus leaving. So just the overall finding before I get into the Q&A session is that most advocates are satisfied with their experiences and most aren't thinking about leaving the animal protection movement. That said, there are several areas where we saw room for improvement, and among those were leadership, burnout, and harassment or discrimination. So perhaps unsurprisingly, a lot of the questions that we got focused on those particular areas. So what I'm going to do today is talk first about questions pertaining to leadership, then a few about discrimination and harassment, and then I will answer any questions that come in during the session at the end. And this Q&A is a new format that we're trying out, so it's meant to allow a chance for people to read our report and ask follow-up questions, whether that's about interpretation, additional analyses that we might have conducted, anything that you're wondering about after reading the findings to make it more useful. So to dive right in, the first question I want to cover is this one. I noticed that problems with leadership were a significant issue for groups to contend with, and I'm curious about more detail about that. So this is a great question because we put the leadership finding in the top line key findings, but there is more detail that we can get from the survey. So more specifically, and if you want to see this yourself, you can click on the supplemental materials tab of our report. You'll find a more detailed graph of reasons that people left past organizations. So breaking down the ones that are more related to leadership, we saw that 22% had left a previous organization because leaders' decisions weren't fair and transparent. So fairness generally. 21% because leaders showed a lack of professionalism. And then there were a number of other issues that were also in the top 10 that are related to leadership without being as explicitly about leadership. So there we saw that burnout was common, unreasonable demands were common, a lack of opportunity for career advancement, and not feeling that your work was appreciated. So all of those are things that pertain to leadership and that leaders may be able to work on in their organizations to improve retention. And we also had in this question sort of a follow-on asking about whether additional research about leadership would be useful. And honestly, this is one of the few times that I'm going to say probably research in this area is not the next step that I would recommend. I love doing more research, I love supporting more research, but we actually know quite a bit about how good leadership looks and how it works. And so probably I would put the research toward other issues and suggest that people look to their own organization specifically to see in that organization whether there are particular issues there. For instance, by doing anonymous surveys with your own employees or volunteers to see whether they have any feedback that they can provide to get more specific about a particular organization. Positive leadership in general, we know a fair bit about, and I will talk a little bit more about that in a subsequent question. And so, yeah, actually, I think that question is right now. This question says, I appreciate that leadership is still an issue, but do we train that leadership? aka, are they fixable, or should we replace them with a different type of manager? And my response here is that it depends. It always depends. It depends on your organization, it depends on the people involved, and I think most crucially, it depends on the trust level between the leader and the employees or volunteers, because trust is a crucial element of strong leadership. And if that trust has been eroded at this point, when you're thinking about whether to train or replace, that may not be something that can be reestablished. So this is again somewhere that having an organization specific look at leadership is probably going to be more useful than anything I can tell you in the really broad sense. If you can do a fully anonymous survey to see where people stand with respect to their leadership, you'll probably have a better impression of whether any harm that's been done is irreparable or not. That said, there's training available, and the data says that leadership training does actually work. There's a meta-analysis that came out just a few years ago that I really like, showing that leadership training can be very impactful and have a really positive influence on an organization, measured in everything from employee perceptions to profit margins, if you're not a nonprofit like most of us. And if I were to recommend a particular type of training, my personal go-to, just from what I know of organizational psychology, would be transformational leadership training. So if you haven't heard of this before, they have a few different pillars of transformational leadership, and they all involve the idea of putting your people first. Now, as animal advocates, that might actually sound counterintuitive because we want to put the non-human animals first, but in the context of leadership, thinking about the people that we work with is super important. And just in a nutshell, the main points of transformational leadership are being an inspiring leader, setting high goals but reasonable goals, which is a tricky balance, I know. Acting as a role model for your employees, really modeling the type of work ethic and interpersonal behavior you want them to show. Empowering others, like your employees and volunteers, to think for themselves and make their own decisions rather than making them for those people. And establishing strong relationships with the people you work with, whether at a colleague level, peer level, or an employee-employer level. So you want to be a caring and supportive resource as a leader. And if transformational leadership is something that you think might be useful for you or for your organization, there are courses available online on a variety of different sites. I can't recommend any specific ones, but I would just suggest Googling around for transformational leadership training or other kinds of leadership training if you want to find something that fits better, and just see what you can get. Because as I said, it has been shown that leadership training can be very effective in improving relationships between leaders and others. Next question. What advice would you give to people in leadership roles in the AR movement? So specifically, how can leaders help prevent compassion fatigue or burnout? And what should organizations and leaders do to prevent harassment and discrimination? Okay, so for each of these things, I'm going to refer back again to the transformational leadership idea. If you are able to establish strong relationships with your employees, I'm going to say employees just for the sake of simplicity, but I recognize that there's a pretty wide range of different roles that we see in our organizations, and they may be volunteer roles. If you can establish a strong relationship with your employees, that's a really great starting point for preventing things like compassion fatigue and burnout, because hopefully those employees will feel comfortable coming to you if they are starting to experience those sorts of issues. Compassion fatigue refers to the idea of the work that we do being emotionally difficult, whether we're working hands-on with animals or we're just seeing videos. We know that there's all kinds of horrible things that we're exposed to as advocates on a daily basis, and that can really drain a person. So as a leader, just keep an open line of communication with your employees. Talk about what they need in order to get a break, a mental break from that kind of burden if you can. If you have different roles in your organization, you might be able to switch them from something on the front line to something administrative for a while. Anything like that can help people just take a break, recharge, refresh. But the main thing is just to have that open line of communication so that they feel that they can actually talk to their leaders about the issues they're experiencing without the leader getting defensive or, I don't know, trying strategies that aren't as helpful as just supporting the person in getting the emotional break that they need. And in terms of harassment and discrimination, what can organizations and leaders do to prevent it? So there are trainings available, as I'm sure you know, but I would really encourage that leaders realize that harassment and discrimination prevention starts from the top and also starts with that role modeling, not just of not harassing and not discriminating, but actively engaging with the issue and having deep conversations about the necessity of not just diversity, but inclusion and equity in organizations. So, you know, set up a little group with some of your employees to talk about the issues and do readings. That kind of thing can be really useful. And I would suggest Encompass. If you're not familiar, encompassmovement.org has some great resources for dealing with racial issues in the animal protection movement. And I've read a lot of their stuff myself and found it very helpful. Okay, next up, we had a number of questions, as I mentioned, about the discrimination and harassment section of the report. So first of those is, why did you include discrimination and unfair treatment together in one category? So this is one question, but we actually had a number of people who asked about this, and it's a great question. So discrimination and unfair treatment at first glance seems like a very broad category, but I just want to read you the entire question that we actually asked people because I think that helps as a starting point. So, in the past 5 years, this is what the survey said, in the past 5 years, since 2014, have you experienced discrimination or been treated unfairly in an animal advocacy environment based on any of the following? And then it listed all of the characteristics that are protected in the US or Canada. So race or color, sex, gender identity or expression, sexual orientation, and a number of other characteristics. So I think that first of all, it's useful to note the constraints that are around that discrimination and unfair treatment, that it is based on particular characteristics, the way that discrimination has to be in a legal sense. And the unfair treatment part of that is just sort of a lay rephrasing of discrimination, because actually the definition of discrimination that's used by, for instance, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission is race discrimination involves treating someone unfavorably because of their particular race, personal characteristics, etc. And it's the same for other protected statuses as well. So the basic idea of phrasing it as discrimination or unfair treatment was just to make people feel comfortable that they can talk about unfair treatment they've experienced as long as they're fairly certain that it's based on particular identities that they have, and that they don't need to, that they don't need to know from a legal perspective, did this meet the definition of discrimination or not? Because that is really the difference between discrimination and unfair treatment, is just that legal distinction. Has it been proven in court, for instance? So I think related to that, we got a few questions about whether the rates seemed high or whether there could have been over-reporting, possibly because it does seem like a broad definition. Excuse me. And we did find that up to half of advocates, depending on which type of advocate, paid, unpaid, up to half had experienced discrimination or harassment as reported on this survey. And so in a nutshell, no, I don't think the rates are too high or over-reported, and there's a few reasons for that. The first is that it's important to remember the wording of the question again, that we asked about the past 5 years. And also that it was over a pretty wide variety of contexts. So myself, just my personal experience, I'm actually a little surprised that it wasn't higher over the past 5 years because it included things like um, discrimination or harassment from members of the public, and it could have been in an online setting. I think a lot of us as advocates are used to experiencing some level of harassment at times. And if you haven't, I think that's great. I'm very happy. But I think that it is completely reasonable to see these kind of rates, especially for people who are members of marginalized identities. If you're on the front lines dealing with the public, and you have one of those visible identities, it is a lot more likely that you're going to be targeted. That's something that we've seen in many different surveys, not just ours. And the other reason is that when we compare this to other surveys, it's difficult to do because different surveys have different focuses. Some focus on healthcare settings, some focus on just sexual harassment. We obviously were focusing on the animal advocacy context, the past 5 years, and a wide variety of circumstances. And so it is difficult to do an apples to apples comparison, but I can give you some other numbers just to compare to. So the discrimination in the US survey defined discrimination as differential or unfair treatment of individuals based on self-identified race, ethnicity, gender, or LGBTQ identity. So quite similar to the definition we used. And on that survey, they found that between 1 and 2/3 of racialized Americans, depending on race and circumstances, reported having experienced discrimination. So between 1 and 2/3, actually higher than we saw, but the domains they included had things like not just work domains like pay and promotions, but also interactions with police. And a Pew Research survey recently found that about 4 in 10 women had experienced gender-based discrimination at work. Again, a little bit higher than we saw, but pretty on par, actually. So I think that the rates that we're seeing are, to the best of our ability to say, with a self-reported survey and a not perfectly representative sample, to the best of our ability to say, are probably pretty reasonable and accurate. At the very least, they certainly warrant serious consideration and thinking about how we can do better for people. Another question was, do we know what proportion of advocates who have experienced harassment report it? And of those who report it, how often is there a result or action taken? Unfortunately, we don't know from this survey. I wish in hindsight that we had asked whether any of the instances had been reported, but we didn't. And so all I can say is that from what we know from other research more generally, it seems to be quite a low proportion of incidents that do get reported. So if we can generalize from that, we might guess that something like 20%, 25%, depends where you look, might have been reported. And unfortunately, also the case that when people do report, there's often no action taken, and it can actually have harm for the person who reports. There's a lot of instances of discrimination in response to reporting instances of harassment or discrimination. And I said this at the beginning, but I know a number of new people have joined since then, but if you do have any questions about anything that I am saying, feel free to drop them in the chat. I think that I'll see it if you do, and I'll do my best to answer. The next question I have was, I noticed that problems with leadership was a stronger predictor of someone's likelihood of staying in advocacy than issues of harassment and discrimination. So leadership more than harassment or discrimination. However, the most common source of harassment and discrimination reported was a supervisor or manager within the organization. Could the two be connected? So yes, they absolutely could be connected. and I ran the analysis to look if statistically they are connected. In that case, we did not see a statistically significant result, which does not mean that there necessarily isn't a connection. There were only, I think it was 13 people who had experienced harassment from leadership in particular. So, it's a subset of our entire study sample, and it makes it hard to find statistically significant differences. The difference that we saw, not significant, but the difference that we saw suggested that, if anything, people who have been harassed by a supervisor or manager are generally unhappy with leadership, which makes a lot of sense. But the other way around doesn't necessarily occur. A lot of people who are unhappy with leadership are probably unhappy with leadership for other reasons. It's not always the case, or even a lot of the time the case, that it's because of harassment or anything like that. There are a lot of ways that leadership can be problematic. As I mentioned earlier, things like fairness and transparency, communication, are generally among the top things that are mentioned for leadership. All right, next question. Respondents from marginalized groups said they left previous organizations because the pay was too low or the job benefits weren't good enough. However, it's often difficult to offer high-paying roles or benefits in the nonprofit sector. How can we come to terms with this as we try to create a more diverse and inclusive movement? It's a great question. And it's a difficult question. We know as nonprofits that we don't have a lot of money to work with a lot of the time. And I think what I would say is, first of all, awareness. Be aware of differences in privilege between different employees or volunteers that may make it easier for some people to work with lower pay or poorer benefits than it would for others. I myself have the benefit of a spouse who works for the government and has very good benefits. Someone else may not have that privilege. So the first thing is just awareness and communicating with your employees. And again, I'm just going to come back to the transformational leadership idea. If you have that open line of communication and they feel comfortable coming to you with issues, and you're modeling that kind of behavior yourself, responsiveness and openness, hopefully you can talk about those problems when they arise and do whatever you can to work through them. At the end of the day, we have only as much money as we have, so there might be other ways of being flexible, making other benefits or perks as good as you can, health benefits, flexible work arrangements. Right now we're all working from home, but that's not necessarily always the case. And if you can be as flexible as you can with that kind of thing, that can go a long way to making up for lower salary than you might find in the private sector. Vacation, professional development opportunities, those are other ways that you can make up for it as well. And I think maybe most of all, it's just communication all the time. So if it's not in our power to pay people more, it is always in our power to be transparent about why that's the case, what our salaries look like, what our budgets look like, where our funding comes from. Just communicate what the issues are and how you're trying to work on them, even if you can't do a lot more than that. It's a good starting point. And there are things that you can do as well to be upfront about this before someone is even an employee. So always including your salary range in your job ad. Not doing that has been shown to be problematic for marginalized people. End up getting paid less when you don't do that. So if you're transparent upfront, that tends to lead to more fairness down the road. All right, one other question here. Was work satisfaction, so people who said their work makes them feel satisfied, correlated with people's experiences of harassment or discrimination? And if so, is there anything else we can say about the relationship between the two factors? So I think what they're asking about with people who said their work makes them feel satisfied was this idea of compassion satisfaction, of getting joy or a sense of meaning out of doing something good, out of helping animals, which is really a core component of being an advocate, I hope, for most people. And it was something that we found most advocates said very strongly that they felt they belonged as advocates. They identified with that. And so I did look at this as well. I looked for this correlation and found that there was not a significant relationship between harassment and discrimination and the feeling of being satisfied with one's work. It again could be because of small sample sizes, but I don't think so in this case because it's not such a small sample as in the previous question. It seemed more likely that there isn't really a strong relationship between harassment and discrimination on the one hand and the feeling of being satisfied with being an advocate helping animals. They seem to be pretty different things. So even to the extent that you're experiencing something terrible like harassment at work, you can still feel like you're doing good for animals and giving back. It's just that you don't know for sure which of those things is going to win out, unfortunately, and it may be the case that if you're having a terrible time at work, no matter how much of a positive difference you feel you're making, that may not be enough. So you end up losing people. Okay, I have one last question from my set of questions, which was just other areas where follow-on research would be useful. Someone asked earlier about leadership. I said I would probably put my research elsewhere, and what I would choose would be more on these questions around discrimination, harassment, and marginalized advocates' experiences. There's so much there, and because we know that reporting within the organizational context tends to be very low, anonymous research is one of the only ways that we actually can get data to use to make decisions. So personally, I feel that that's probably where I would put the research to follow up on this. But there are definitely a lot of different areas in here that could probably use more research support. So that is the end of the questions that I was going to go through today. If anyone does have any other questions or wants to chat one-on-one about the results of this research or how you can apply it, I am always very happy to be in touch with our audience and would love if you would reach out to me. My email address is joe, just J-O, at faunalytics.org. Or we also have a virtual office hour that you can find on our website under the menus, Ask Us. So every Wednesday, I or our research scientist Tom will have an office hour, and we would be more than happy to talk to you about the implications of this research, how you can use it, any internal organizational research you might want to do, or really anything else that's related. So I think that wraps us up. Thank you all so much for attending. It was great talking to you, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.